Eric Chaney, he is chief economist at Axa. And Eric, just looking at the market reaction that we've seen this morning, declines in European markets, a sell-off in bank shares, especially in French banks at the moment. Of course, they're exposed to debt in the periphery. But is the concern here, is it just about Greece?
Well, yes, I think that the result of the Greek elections has taken the precedence in the markets compared to the French elections. There is the possibility of a political chaos in Greece, and nobody can exclude a disorderly exit from the euro by Greece, let's say in June, July or August. And that would have ripple effects on Spain, Italy, and all the banks of France. Spain and Italy are by definition heavily exposed to southern countries. So that explains the market reaction. It's Greece more than France.
It's Greece more than France, but what about the possibility of this spreading beyond Greece? There have been some economists voicing concern about a potential bailout for Spain as well.
Yeah, what is likely to happen is that the Spanish government will have to ask its European peers for a loan to recapitalize the Spanish banks. And that is one of the missions of the EFSF, now called the ESM. Spanish government is a bit reluctant to do that, but in the end they will have to bite the bullet.
And Eric, we're also seeing, if you look at the spread between French bonds and German bonds this morning, relatively unchanged. Does that suggest that investors are essentially unfazed by Mr. Hollande's victory?
Well, the victory of François Hollande was fully priced by the markets. So there were no reasons why the spread would have changed. The rendezvous will be the 2013 budget, but we will know nothing about the budget before August. So the markets will wait until then to test the future of the French fiscal policy.
So, and also we've got the parliamentary election coming up in June. Does that mean then, if you're looking ahead to those two as being key events, does that mean there's more downside risk in the markets as in the next few months?
Well, there are definitely downside risks linked to the Greek situation, ripple effects on Spain. Spain is the epicenter of the crisis right now. As far as France is concerned, I think it's not before August, September.
So, Mr. Moisi, let me start by asking you about France's relations abroad, because Nicolas Sarkozy really stamped his personality on this. That was his approach to foreign policy. So how might that change under President Hollande?
I would say one will see continuity minus in terms of style. It will be less flashy, less impulsive at times, but also continuity in terms of content. Relation with the United States may be less close, relation with Israel may be less close, but basically it will be a policy of continuity. And when one comes to Europe, I think one should see the election of François Hollande not as a turning point, but as an accelerating factor in a direction which Europe was going to take anyway, which is to introduce growth next to austerity. So from my point of view, no break, but a different continuity.
Yes. And so, Mr. Chaney, what are your thoughts on that? Do you expect to see much of a change in terms of France's relationship with Europe?
No, I think I broadly agree with Dominique Moisi that the changes will be incremental. There are two different issues. One is crisis management. And Nicolas Sarkozy was very effective in terms of crisis management at the beginning of the crisis. Now we are more or less at the tail of the crisis. We will see whether Mr. Hollande will have to prove his leadership in crisis management if something wrong happens with Greece. And the second big issue is the relationship with Germany. Obviously, this is the most important bond in the euro area. And my understanding is that the Germans have understood that the French need some leeway in terms of promoting growth together with fiscal austerity, which is simply fiscal sustainability, and that a compromise will be found. But it will be slightly different from what it was during Sarkozy, because I think that, for instance, the new French government will insist on the issuance of Eurobonds, which will be rejected by Germany. But there are elections in Germany in 2013, and maybe at that point in time, the French position, which was also the position of the previous president, might prevail for Eurobonds.
And a key word that you mentioned there, Eric, is compromise. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Moisi? One of them is going to have to compromise in all of this. You know, a lot of the people that we've been speaking to throughout the morning echo your sentiment that really very little has changed. Ultimately, Mr. Hollande is going to be constrained by the reality here in Europe. But when you look at the position of France and Germany, it is actually very different. And Hollande is calling for these Euro bonds. He wants more of a mutualization of debt. And Germany wants something very different.
Yes, but at some point they will have to come together. They both realize in Paris and in Berlin that a compromise between the two countries is absolutely vital. And no one wants to enter in history as the man or the woman that break Europe. I think there are tensions in Germany within the coalition of Mrs. Merkel, and there is a moment of very short grace in France as the president comes in.
Those tensions that are affecting Merkel work in Mr. Hollande's favor?
They worked in the events are working in Mr. Hollande's favors in the very short term, which is the crisis in Greece. But they work against him as they work against all European leaders because the gravity, the seriousness of the events which we are facing have no precedent. I mean, you have always to keep in mind the major difference between 1981 and 2012. The crisis in Europe is much more serious in 2012, and the president has much less experience of power, but much more understanding of economic realities than was the case with François Mitterrand.
Eric Chaney, what are your thoughts on that? It seems to be a double-edged sword because on the one hand, it looks as though Mr. Hollande is going to have to embark on some very serious reform that is going to bite, and it seems as though this country may not be prepared for that. That will shore up France's position in the markets, but of course there could end up being a political public backlash to those reforms, which means that he, like Sarkozy and many other leaders, falls victim to the debt crisis.
Well, I've read the platform of François Hollande and I have not seen any structural reform in this platform. And there is no other way to increase the potential growth of this country than to free up companies and do the structural reforms that President Sarkozy started to do. So in my opinion, at some point, the next government will have to embrace some of these reforms. Growth is not something that you can decree. There is no money to spend to stimulate growth. So it will have to come from the reforms which are not yet in the agenda of the president.
All right, well, Mr.
No, I fully agree with that. I think at some point, the new president will have to reassure all the Frenchmen that didn't vote for him and to frustrate all the Frenchmen that voted for him. That's the condition for a successful presidency.
Well, great to get your insight and analysis, gentlemen. Mr. Dominique Moisi, Deputy Director at the French Institute for International Relations, and of course, Mr. Eric Chaney as well, Chief Economist at Axa. Thank you both for your time.